The day I retired was supposed to be a celebration, a moment to honor 70 years of life, decades of sacrifice, and the closing of a long career that had seen me build something from nothing. Instead, that night nearly became the end of my life. My daughter-in-law raised a sparkling glass of champagne to toast me, her lips curled in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. What she didn't know was that I saw her hand trembling ever so slightly as she handed me that glass. And what she could never have imagined was that I would notice the bitter, almost almond-like scent rising from the bubbles, a scent no champagne in the world should ever carry. I had been around long enough to recognize poison, even if Jessica thought I wouldn't. She thought I would drink it, fall, and die quietly, leaving behind the $23 million my late husband and I had earned after selling our company. But I didn't drink it. I switched glasses when she wasn't looking, placing the tainted one in front of her own mother, who eagerly took a sip. Within minutes, Helen collapsed, gasping for breath. The party turned into chaos. And while everyone screamed for help, Jessica's face went pale. She knew exactly what had just happened. My son, Michael, rushed to his wife's side, not his mother's. And that told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalty truly was. They weren't planning to build a family with me in it. They wanted me gone, out of the way, so they could claim what they thought they deserved. But they had underestimated me. At 70 years old, I was not a frail woman ready to be discarded. I was Sarah Sullivan, businesswoman, widow, mother, and I was about to fight back with every ounce of strength I had left. Before I take you deeper into this story, let me ask, have you ever felt the sting of betrayal from your own family, the people you raised and sacrificed everything for? Have you ever been treated as though your life no longer mattered, as though your worth was only measured in dollars and inheritance? If you have, you'll understand my journey. If you haven't, I hope this story opens your eyes. Please, before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing the places this community reaches. Now, let me tell you how I uncovered my son and daughter-in-law's plan to erase me, and how I turned their own scheme against them. When Robert, my husband of 45 years, passed away from lung cancer, I thought the hardest part of my life had already arrived. He had been my partner in everything: marriage, raising our son, and building the small manufacturing business that eventually grew into something none of us could have predicted. For decades, we lived modestly. Robert drove the same pickup truck for 15 years, I clipped coupons, and our vacations were simple road trips instead of luxury cruises. That was just who we were: quiet savers, never flashy, never careless. So when the attorney sat me down after his funeral and revealed the truth, I felt as if I had stepped into someone else's life. $30 million. That was the final value of the company after Robert sold it, investing carefully until the end. He never once told me the exact figure. He said he didn't want me to worry about numbers, only about living. Now, with him gone, I was the sole heir. $30 million, and I had no idea what to do with it, other than keep living the way I always had. But money has a strange way of changing people, especially family. At first, Rachel, my daughter-in-law Jessica, and even Michael put on their masks of sympathy and grief. They helped around the house, checked in daily, and made sure I was eating. For a moment, I thought Robert's death had drawn us closer. I was grateful, even comforted, by their presence. But the mask slipped faster than I expected. Within weeks, Michael began making offhand remarks about how much I really needed at my age. "Mom," he said once, his tone sweet but his eyes sharp, "you're 70 years old. Do you really need all that money just sitting there? Wouldn't it be smarter to put it to use, for the family, for Tyler's college, for us?" Jessica chimed in with her silky voice, adding, "You could still live comfortably, Sarah. Just transfer the accounts into something Michael can help manage. It would take the pressure off you." Pressure. That was the word she used, as though financial security was somehow a burden. I smiled politely, but inside my stomach knotted. It wasn't just their words, it was their urgency, the way their conversation seemed rehearsed, the way they pressed again and again, never giving me a moment to simply grieve my husband. I told them no, gently at first, then firmly. But my refusal only deepened the cracks in their masks. Their smiles grew tighter, their patience thinner. And soon, it wasn't just words. The mailbox outside my home was pried open one night, my letters scattered across the yard. Another morning, I found the trash bin overturned, its contents spilling into the driveway. Harmless acts, maybe, if they stood alone. But then, one evening as I drove home from church, my brakes failed on the downhill curve. The car skidded into a ditch, metal crunching against gravel, smoke curling up into the cold night air. I should have died then, but I didn't. And as I sat there, shaking, waiting for the tow truck, I couldn't ignore the thought whispering in my mind, this wasn't an accident. Robert had trusted me to protect the life we built, to carry forward not just the money, but the values behind it. And now, I knew, I wasn't just protecting his legacy. I was protecting my very life. I wish I could tell you that my near accident with the car brakes was enough to wake me up completely, but the truth is, when it comes to family, your heart wants to believe the best. You make excuses, you rationalize, you cling to the hope that blood ties mean loyalty. But sometimes blood ties are the very rope that others use to try and strangle you. Michael and Jessica's efforts grew bolder. They stopped pretending it was about helping me manage things and started framing it as inevitable, even necessary. Mom, Michael told me one Sunday afternoon, Jessica and I already talked to an advisor. He says the smartest move is to consolidate everything under one account. It's just paperwork. We can handle it for you. You shouldn't stress at your age. His words cut me, not just because of the implication that I was some fragile old woman, but because Robert used to say almost the same thing, except his tone carried care, not greed. I looked at my son that day, really looked at him. His jaw clenched, his hands restless, his eyes darting in that way they did when he was hiding something. This wasn't the boy I raised. This was a man in debt, desperate, cornered. Jessica was even worse. She wrapped her schemes in sugar, always smiling, always placing a gentle hand on mine as though I were some naive elder she could soothe into submission. One evening she leaned in close and whispered, "Think about Tyler, Sarah. Don't you want him to have a future? The tuition, the house, we just need your cooperation." Her voice was velvet, but her eyes gleamed cold, like polished steel. Tyler. My sweet grandson. The only innocence left in that household. I could see him playing on the floor while they spun their webs around me. He'd glance up with that bright smile, completely unaware of the storm raging between his parents and me. That was their cruelest tactic, dangling his future like a pawn, as though love for my grandson could be weaponized against me. But they didn't stop there. Their plan escalated. I heard whispers about Sunset Manor, a retirement facility I knew all too well. Families sometimes placed their elders there when they became too difficult. Michael suggested it casually, over coffee, his tone carefully measured. "Mom, you'd have company there, people your age. They have great doctors. You wouldn't have to worry about bills or maintenance. Jessica and I could take care of everything." I almost laughed at the audacity of it. A gilded cage, dressed up as a gift. They weren't offering me freedom, they were plotting my imprisonment. And behind the polished brochures and pretty words, I heard the truth, they wanted me tucked away, legally silenced, while they drained my accounts. That's when the poison came. I noticed it first in the way Jessica hovered at gatherings, always eager to pour my champagne, always watching a little too closely when I lifted the glass. Something inside me screamed caution. Robert used to say I had business instincts, a gut sense for when deals weren't what they seemed. Now, those instincts told me, don't drink. So, at my retirement celebration, when Jessica handed me a glass, I smiled, lifted it, and then, with the most casual sleight of hand, I swapped it for hers when she wasn't looking. Seconds later, Helen, Jessica's own mother, lifted that very glass and took a sip. Within minutes she was clutching her stomach, gasping, her face pale as wax. The room exploded into chaos. Guests screamed, someone called 911, and Jessica's mask cracked in an instant. The look in her eyes told me everything. It wasn't grief for her mother, it was panic that her plan had failed. That poison had been meant for me. And now, everyone would start asking questions she never wanted asked. I stood there, calm on the outside though my heart thundered inside my chest, and I realized Robert was right. He always said strength wasn't about muscles or money, it was about clarity. In that moment, clarity burned through me like fire. This wasn't just greed. This was attempted murder. My own son and his wife had crossed the line, and if I didn't act swiftly, I wouldn't live to tell the tale. The ambulance had barely pulled away with Helen inside when I made my decision. If Michael and Jessica thought they were the only ones capable of plotting, they had forgotten who they were dealing with. I didn't survive 45 years in business, growing a small shop into a company worth $23 million, by being naive. They saw my gray hair, my wrinkles, my slower step, and thought I was an easy mark. But beneath these lines lies the same woman who outnegotiated ruthless competitors, who clawed her way through setbacks, and who buried her husband with dignity and carried on. The very next morning, I called David Hartwell, my attorney of 30 years. David had seen me through acquisitions, lawsuits, audits, you name it. When I told him what had happened at the party, he was silent for a long moment, then said in that steady voice of his, "Sarah, this isn't just inheritance meddling anymore. This is attempted homicide. We need to move fast. We'll protect your assets and build a wall they can't climb." First came the will. I updated it that very week, cutting Michael out almost entirely. Instead of the lump sum he expected, he would receive a modest yearly stipend, enough to live decently, but never enough to squander or gamble away. The bulk of my wealth went into a living trust, managed by trustees who owed loyalty only to me. That trust couldn't be touched by anyone, not Michael, not Jessica, not even a slick-talking psychiatrist they might hire to declare me incompetent. Next, David and I tackled the power of attorney. Michael had been pushing me relentlessly to sign one, a document that would have given him total control of my finances if I ever became unable to handle them myself. I shredded the draft he had left on my desk and signed a new version with David, naming a professional fiduciary instead. If my mind ever faltered, my estate would still be safe. But I didn't stop at paperwork. I took steps in the physical world too. I installed a new security system at my house, cameras, locks, even silent alarms. Michael laughed when he heard, saying, "Paranoid, Mom?" But I saw the flicker in his eyes, the irritation that I was slipping further out of their grasp. Meanwhile, Jessica tried to play damage control. Helen had survived but remained in the hospital, and whispers swirled among friends and neighbors about the strange incident at my party. Jessica came to see me one afternoon, her face pale, her eyes red as though she had been crying. She sat at my kitchen table and murmured, "I don't know what happened, Sarah. I swear I'd never hurt anyone." But her hands trembled, and when she reached for mine, I noticed faint scratches on her wrist, the same wrist I'd seen brush against my champagne glass the night before Helen collapsed. I smiled politely, poured her tea, and said nothing of what I knew. I had learned long ago, never show your cards until you're ready to win. Behind the scenes, I began to build my case. With David's help, I hired a private investigator. We dug into Michael and Jessica's finances, and the picture that emerged was worse than I had imagined. They were drowning in debt, mortgages they couldn't pay, credit cards maxed out, and a lifestyle that belonged to millionaires instead of two people barely scraping by. They had been banking on my death to bail them out. My life, to them, was nothing more than a check waiting to be cashed. The investigator also uncovered something else, a name that would prove crucial later, Dr. Leonard Steinberg, a psychiatrist Jessica had consulted. He had a reputation for conveniently declaring elderly clients unfit whenever families wanted control of estates. Jessica had already laid the groundwork. If the poison hadn't worked, the next step would have been a declaration that I was senile, followed by a one-way trip to Sunset Manor. Knowing this chilled me to my core, but it also fueled my resolve. They were treating me like a problem to be solved, a locked vault to be cracked open. But I was neither. I was a woman with a sharp mind, a survivor, and a grandmother who still had reasons to live. The night I finished signing the last batch of legal documents, I sat alone in my living room, sipping tea instead of champagne. I looked around at the house Robert and I had built together, the family photos on the mantel, the worn armchair where he used to read, and I whispered, "They won't take this from me. Not while I still breathe." What Michael and Jessica didn't know was that I had already set the wheels in motion. By the time they tried again, I would be ready. And when the mask finally slipped, the world would see them for who they really were. It didn't take long for Michael and Jessica to make their next move. I had been waiting for it, expecting it, even. What I didn't know was how brazen it would be. They showed up one evening, uninvited, standing on my doorstep as though nothing had happened. Michael wore that forced grin, the same one he used as a child when caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Jessica clung to his arm, her face composed but her eyes darting nervously. "Mom," Michael began, too sweetly, "Jessica and I have been talking. We think it's time you let us help with your affairs. It's just, you've been under a lot of stress lately. Don't you think it would be easier if someone else handled things for you?" I looked at them, then at the manila folder he carried. I didn't have to open it to know it contained the power of attorney papers they were still desperate for me to sign. I felt the air tighten around us. This was their second attempt, not poison this time, but pressure, manipulation, and psychological warfare. I invited them in, not because I wanted to, but because I needed them comfortable. Over tea, Jessica launched into her rehearsed lines. "Sarah, we really just want what's best for you. Sunset Manor has wonderful care. You'd have company your own age. And Michael can take care of all those complicated financial decisions." Her voice dripped with false kindness, and for a moment I pictured Helen in that hospital bed, poisoned by her own daughter's ambition. My jaw tightened. "That's generous," I said softly, "but I've already taken care of my affairs." Michael's face darkened instantly, the mask slipping. "What do you mean?" I leaned back, savoring the moment. "I updated my will. I set up a trust. And I shredded the documents you left me. You don't control a cent of my estate, Michael. Not now, not ever." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Jessica blinked rapidly, her facade crumbling. Michael's knuckles whitened around the folder in his hands. He opened his mouth, but before he could spit out whatever venom brewed in his throat, there was a knock at the door. It was Detective Harris, the officer I'd been working with quietly since the night of the party. I had shared my suspicions, the forensic evidence from Helen's glass, and the financial records David and the investigator had uncovered. Tonight, Harris had come with purpose. "Michael, Jessica," he said firmly, stepping inside, "we need to ask you both some questions regarding the attempted poisoning of Helen Cartwright." Jessica's face drained of color. "That was an accident," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't." But Harris cut her off. "We found traces of oleander extract in Sarah's champagne glass. The one she switched before handing it to Helen. Do you know what the penalty is for attempted murder in this state?" Michael shut up, pointing at me with fury. "You set us up. You always wanted me to fail." I stood slowly, steady as stone. "No, Michael. I wanted you to live with integrity. I wanted you to value people over money. But you chose greed, and you tried to kill me for it. That's something I will never forgive." Jessica broke first. Her voice rose into a desperate wail, words tumbling out like stones. "It was his idea. He said you'd never give us the money. He made me do it." Michael turned on her with venom. "Liar. You poured it into the glass, you're the one who said she was old and useless." Their carefully crafted partnership shattered right there in my living room, dissolving into screaming accusations. Detective Harris let them crumble before finally stepping forward with 2 sets of handcuffs. The sound of metal clicking shut around their wrists was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. As they were led out, Jessica sobbing, Michael snarling, I felt something unexpected, not triumph, but grief. Grief for the boy I had raised, who had once held my hand when we crossed the street, who had brought me daisies from the yard when he was 5. Somewhere along the way, that boy had been consumed by entitlement, by greed, until he saw his own mother not as family, but as a bank vault to be broken into. I stood in the quiet house after they were gone, tears stinging my eyes, and whispered to the empty room, I lost my son tonight. But I saved myself. The next weeks moved quickly. Jessica was charged with attempted murder and conspiracy. Michael was charged as an accomplice, the financial evidence sealing his fate. The courts took no pity. Jessica received 15 years in prison. Michael, 3 years. Their debts swallowed everything they had left. Their dreams of easy wealth died as swiftly as Helen had almost died that night at my party. And me? I was left standing. Scarred, but not broken. The silence after the trial was deafening. For weeks, my home had been filled with investigators, lawyers, whispered strategy sessions, and the heavy presence of betrayal hanging in every corner. Now, it was just me, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and the faint smell of jasmine from the garden Robert once tended. I thought grief would drown me. Not grief for Jessica, her absence felt like the lifting of a storm, but for Michael. My son. The child I had carried, nurtured, taught, and defended. A piece of me had always hoped he would choose love over greed, that somewhere under the layers of resentment and Jessica's influence, the boy I once knew still existed. But when the judge read the sentence, and Michael refused to even look at me, I understood. That boy was gone. And I had to let him go. I spent long evenings with Helen in the weeks after her recovery. She had survived the poisoning attempt, though her body remained fragile. I raised a monster, she whispered once, tears carving lines down her face. I reached across the table and took her hand. So did I. We sat together in silence, two mothers bound not by blood, but by the scars of betrayal. Neither of us had planned this bond, but it grew naturally, rooted in shared pain and the determination to keep living. It was Emma, my granddaughter, who became the unexpected light in all this darkness. She was only 17, caught between loyalty to her father and love for her grandmother. She visited often, shy at first, but with every passing week, she opened up more. We baked together in the kitchen, laughed at old family photos, and sat on the porch watching sunsets. One evening, she asked, Grandma, do you hate my dad? The question pierced me like a blade. I thought long before answering. I don't hate him, Emma. Hate would mean I still expected something from him. I'm sad. Sad for who he became. Sad for what he chose. But you? You're not him. You get to choose who you'll be. And I believe you'll choose better. Her eyes welled with tears as she leaned into my arms. In that moment, I realized I had not lost everything. Love was still possible. Family, in its truest sense, was still possible. Life slowly regained rhythm. I updated my will one final time, ensuring that my assets, carefully placed in trust, would one day support causes I cared about: elder abuse prevention, legal aid for vulnerable seniors, scholarships for young women in business. I wanted my pain to build something lasting, something bigger than myself. I also invested in myself in ways I had once postponed. I traveled, short trips at first, then further. I took painting classes, rediscovered music, and even attended community events where I spoke about financial abuse among the elderly. At first my voice trembled, but with each story I shared, with each survivor who nodded through tears, I grew stronger. The whispers in town eventually faded. People who once looked at me with pity began to look at me with respect. Not because I had money, many knew that already, but because I had endured, and I had chosen to rise instead of crumble. Years later, when Emma graduated from college, she invited me to sit in the front row. As she walked across the stage to accept her degree in criminal justice, she glanced into the audience, found me, and smiled. In her eyes, I saw not just pride, but purpose. She wanted to fight for justice, for people like me, like Helen, like the countless others who had been betrayed by those closest to them. In that moment, I realized something profound. Michael and Jessica had taken so much from me: trust, peace, even illusions about family. But they had not taken my spirit. They had not taken my ability to love, to build, to matter. And through Emma, part of me would live on in the world, not tainted by greed, but strengthened by resilience. When I sit on my porch now, watching the sky bleed into shades of orange and purple, I think less about what I lost and more about what I found. Independence. Strength. A granddaughter who sees me not as a burden, but as a guide. And a life still worth living, even after betrayal cuts so deeply. So, I'll ask you, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Could you forgive a child who tried to end your life? Or would you close the door forever? Have you or someone you know faced a betrayal this sharp, from the very people meant to protect and love you? Share your stories below, I read every one. And tell me, which story should we explore next? Because life, as cruel as it can be, is also full of survival, resilience, and second chances.